Matthew 27 and Mark 15. Well, in piecing our four Gospels together, we learn that on Friday morning, the day of Jesus' crucifixion, he stood in front of four different individuals for what amounts to 6 trials. Caiaphas was the first. He was the Jewish high priest installed by Rome. After he talks to Jesus, and Jesus is basically silent, he'll go to Annas. That's his father-in-law. Still, he was a high priest at one point before, but he still kind of has an emeritus role. He then comes back to Caiaphas, who finds him guilty and sends him on to Pilate. Now, these would be Roman trials, 3 Jewish and 3 Roman. Pilate hears that Herod Antipas is in town. He's been installed as a puppet governor up in Galilee, but he's in town for the Passover, so he goes to Herod, and then he comes back to Pilate for that famous scene where Pilate hands him over to the Jewish mob. So we'll talk about these in turn, but let's begin with Caiaphas. Caiaphas again reigns from 18 to 36 A.D. Notice he will not be there much longer than Jesus after Jesus ascends. What is sad is that we learn back in Matthew 26:3, well before this moment, of course, in the trial, then the chief priests, scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest who was called Caiaphas. In other words, a conspiracy was going on before Jesus ever appears in front of him on Friday morning. A week earlier, there had been a conspiracy in Caiaphas's home that he would be found guilty. So it was hardly to be considered a trial. When in 26:57 it says, "And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled." The trial thus becomes a sham. Again, the purpose of these Jewish trials was to see if Jesus was guilty of theological blasphemy, especially against the name of Yahweh, which by this point in Jewish history was very important and to be revered. We'll talk again more about this as we go, but that's what they were trying to determine through Jesus. Had he blasphemed Yahweh? The Roman trials, as it were, could care less about theology, obviously. They were concerned about political sedition, and they were extremely cruel to those who they believed were guilty of insurrection. Jesus is placed on the cross by 9 a.m. He will be there until 3, or he will die around 3 p.m. So 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., and we'll come back to this in a moment. The two events that happen, and they're almost parabolic in the sense that they're real events, but they have meaning far beyond the physical idea of what happens. And let's talk about them quickly, because it is repeated a total of 6 times in the New Testament. We hear of the veil at Jesus' death being torn. Well, what did that symbolize? Remember our big story that we have been recommending. The idea of coming in to God's home, having access, not getting across a great divide, but having access to Yahweh, was always in the mind of the person who wanted not just to be right with God, but to serve God, but to worship God. And so notice how that veil being torn is really saying everyone, at any time. Not that this couldn't be true before. Again, I don't think the temple was in service in Yahweh's mind. He never, and this is reflected in the ministry of Jesus. The temple itself was an accommodation to how people thought of where Yahweh, quote unquote, lived. Obviously, Yahweh didn't live here. This room, the Holy of Holies, was empty. There was no Ark of the Covenant. But the tearing of the veil is just basically saying we have access. Everyone now has access, even though you had it before. Now it's very clear that there is no hint of denying access to the Creator God in all of His glory. And frankly, I think, again, this is something that Jesus had been intending to teach His entire ministry. The other thing that happens is quite strange, frankly, and we've always thought of this as a strange thing. It says at the end of Matthew 27 that when Jesus died, not when He rose, but when He died at 3 o'clock p.m. that day, many graves were opened and people walked around in the city of Jerusalem. Again, it's an odd idea. I would not call these resurrections, because I reserve that word for Jesus. I would call these resuscitations in the sense that these people probably went back to their graves or something like that. They died again. But the idea here, again, it's a word picture, or it's an idea that needs to be taught, and we'll see this in the rest of the New Testament, that death itself, because of what Jesus is doing here, and especially his resurrection, death itself is being reversed. And so it's very symbolic or picturesque in meaning that corpses got up and walked around and then apparently, as we say, died again. But I want to end with this. At one point in the time on the cross, extreme pain that Jesus is going through, remember he says this, it's only in Matthew and Mark, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, God mine, why have you forsaken me? What's going on there? Well, remember, this is a quotation from Psalm 22. The lead verse of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's the traditional cry of the loyalist in times of pain. Even verse 10 from Psalm 22, I was cast upon you from birth, from my mother's womb you have been my God. So this very statement, my God, is not meant to say, God, you are turning your back on me. And I've heard it sometimes said that Jesus experienced God's turning away from him at this moment. Let me recommend, in closing, I think that would be one of the most dangerous things to introduce to the biblical story at this point that we ever could. I mean, in everything we've learned about the biblical story, does God ever turn his back on his loyalist? No. So why would God turn his back on Jesus now? Unless a person would want to go back and change the entire story of the Bible from the very beginning. God never turns away from the person who is his loyalist, even in sin. So again, the issue of Jesus carrying sin or whatever, as theologically heavy or true as that might be, that has nothing to do with the idea that God would actually forsake Jesus. So I think what Jesus is doing is crying out that traditional painful cry, oh God, where are you? But at no time has God ever before, and at no time now, is God turning his back on Jesus. My recommendation would be that Jesus has God's love now more than ever.